The first rays of dawn crept over the misty fields of Susquehanna County, casting a dull glow across the quiet, weathered houses. The stillness of that October morning in 2012 would linger in the memories of the town for years. Not for what was seen, but for what was lost. Clarence Bidd, a seasoned journeyman electrician, with nearly 20 years etched into calloused hands and worn boots, moved with practiced precision as he packed the last of his gear into bed of his silver 1999 Ford F-150. The engine rumbled low as he backed out the cracked driveway, headlights briefly illuminating the solemn face of his wife, Reba, who stood on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself against the chill. "Be back Sunday," he called out, his voice a gravelly promise swallowed almost immediately by the dense fog rolling off the fields. Reba nodded stiffly, watching as his taillights disappeared down the lonesome country road, leaving only silence and a hollow ache she would later claim felt like nothing more than routine. Clarence never made it back. By Monday morning, the sun had risen twice more and the house sat dark and empty. The calls Reba made to his cell phone went unanswered, each one growing shorter, sharper, more frantic. At 7:12 a.m., hands trembling, she dialed the Susquehanna County Sheriff's Office to report her husband missing. She explained he had gone hunting, alone, as he always did, near a vast stretch of remote game reserve, the kind of place where cell signals died and people could tune unnoticed. Deputies listened, nodding through the details. The stress Clarence had carried lately, the layoffs at the Montour power plant, the way it seemed quieter, heavier these past few months. A missing man in rugged backwoods territory wasn't uncommon. Accidents happened. Still, they launched a search within hours. Bloodhounds combing trails, helicopters scouring endless forests, searchers calling Clarence's name into an indifferent wilderness. Not a boot print, not a tire track, not a single glimpse of Clarence Bidd, nor the truck he loved almost as much as he hated leaving home. And yet, 3 weeks later, as November's frost began to silver the ground, a letter arrived for Reba, postmarked from Buffalo, New York. Its scrawled words chilled more than the weather. "I'm gone. I need peace. Don't look for me." There was no signature, only the faint imprint of a hand that seemed to want to vanish itself from the page. Reba, holding the trembling paper, insisted it was Clarence's handwriting. Investigators weren't so sure, but with no evidence of foul play, and a letter hinting at a man's desperate escape from a crumbling life, the case was quietly reclassified. Voluntary disappearance. No body, no crime. No truck, no trail. Only silence, growing thicker with every passing year. But the truth, as it turned out, wasn't buried deep in the forest. It was hiding in plain sight, waiting for a chance encounter on a dusty highway. Nearly 8 years later, when a gray pickup with expired plates drifted into the crosshairs of a routine traffic stop. The man behind the wheel wasn't Clarence Bidd, but the truck was. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next crime stories. Clarence Ray Bidd was not the kind of man people easily remembered, at least not in a way that photographs or party invitations might suggest. He moved through life with a quiet perseverance, an invisible stitch in the patchwork of Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. Born in 1976 to a coal miner and a diner waitress, Clarence grew up breathing in the thick grit of hard work and low expectations. From a young age, Clarence seemed older than his years, a boy who didn't ask for much and learned even faster not to expect it. His world was built from cracked pavement, hand-me-down boots, and the eternal scent of engine grease lingering on his father's flannel shirts. By 16, Clarence had abandoned any fantasy of college, taking on odd jobs: farmhand, scrapyard runner, line cook. Anything that paid enough to keep gas in a rusted-out Chevy S10, he nursed like a wounded animal. He didn't talk much, not because he had nothing to say, but because life in Susquehanna taught him early that nobody really listened. In the fall of 1998, Clarence met Reba Dalton at a county fair, over the clatter of horseshoes and the heavy perfume of fried dough. Reba was sunshine in a town too used to rain. fiery, impulsive, and unafraid to laugh too loud or love too fast. Clarence, for all his careful silences, found himself orbiting her like a moth around a flame he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. They married 2 years later in a modest ceremony behind the VFW hall, Reba in a borrowed lace dress and Clarence in his only good suit, which he fidgeted in like a man wearing someone else's life. They built their home small, square, and stoic, on a half-acre lot gifted by Reba's uncle, nestled between cornfields and a patch of stubborn forest. Their early years were simple and marked by a hard-earned contentment. Clarence landed steady work at Montour Power Plant, an aging coal-fired facility clinging to relevance as cleaner energy options rose elsewhere. It wasn't glamorous work. Long shifts in stifling heat, endless noise, the ever-present grit of ash coating everything. But paid the bills, bought groceries, kept the roof mended. For Reba, who dreamed in muted shades of suburban normalcy, it was enough. For Clarence, who measured his life in hours clocked and debts paid, it was everything. Yet even in the best of times, a certain weight seemed to cling to him, a quiet, bone-deep weariness that no paycheck could lighten. He loved Reba. He loved the steady rhythms of their life. But he also carried a growing sense that something vital was slipping through his calloused fingers, something he couldn't name. Then came the layoffs. In the spring of 2012, amid tightening regulations and dwindling profits, Montour's management slashed a third of its workforce. Clarence, a loyal employee with 2 decades of service, wasn't spared. Reba found him sitting at the kitchen table that evening, a pink slip clutched between cracked hands, staring at nothing. At first, they told themselves it was temporary. Clarence took odd electrical jobs where he could, rewiring old barns, installing lighting at the few stores that hadn't shuttered in town. But work was scarce, and the bills were relentless. The tension seeped into their home like black mold, silent but suffocating. Reba, ever the optimist, suggested they move. "Start fresh," she said. "Maybe near my cousin in Erie. Bigger town, more jobs." But Clarence recoiled at the idea, leaving the land, the house, the history etched into every creaking floorboard and faded photograph. His roots ran too deep to pull up without bleeding. Instead, Clarence withdrew further into himself. He spent long hours restoring the F-150, not because it needed fixing, but because it gave his hands something to do, his mind somewhere to hide. Some nights he drove out to the game reserve, parking beneath the skeletal trees. Sitting alone with the engine idling and the radio tuned to static, Reba noticed a change, the way he flinched from her touch, the hollow cadence of his words. She asked, pleaded, demanded answers he didn't know how to give. And when he packed up that chilly October morning, rifle slung over one shoulder and thermos in hand, she told herself it was just Clarence being Clarence. He always came back. But this time he didn't. His absence wasn't immediate chaos. It was a slow leak of certainty. A missing shirt here, an untouched plate there, the air heavier with each hour, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And when the letter arrived, hinting at escape, even to people who loved him most, those few who had seen the heavy chains he carried without ever truly understanding them, had to wonder. Had Clarence Bidd simply walked away from the life that always felt too small for him? Or had something darker, something far less voluntary, dragged him into the silence? The morning Clarence Bidd disappeared unfolded in slow gray layers, like a sky threatening snow that never quite falls. It was October 19th, 2012, the kind of cold that seeps under doors and into bones. Reba remembered waking to the sound of the coffee pot gurgling, the familiar clatter of Clarence's boots against the worn kitchen tiles. For a moment, all seemed right, normal. She smiled into her pillow, expecting him to return and brush a kiss across her forehead the way he always did before heading out for a day in the woods or on odd jobs. But the kiss never came. When she shuffled into the kitchen 20 minutes later, Clarence was gone. His thermos was missing from the counter. So was his battered Remington 700, the rifle he always carried when he planned to scout for deer, though hunting season was still weeks away. His truck, too, had vanished from its usual spot beneath the leaning elm in their driveway. At first, Reba thought little of it. Clarence often disappeared for a few hours, chasing some solitary ritual that she had long since learned not to question. But by nightfall, when the truck still hadn't returned and the house seemed to ache with emptiness, a low, persistent unease began to tighten in her chest. By the second day, unease hardened into fear. The first call she made was to his best friend, Wayne Keller, a gruff mechanic who had known Clarence since high school. Wayne hadn't seen him. Said he hadn't heard from him, either not in days. Next, Reba phoned the small circle of relatives still living nearby. No one had. It was as if Clarence had stepped into the cold morning mist and simply dissolved. On the third day, Reba drove the 15 miles into town to file a missing person report. Deputy Sharon Welks met her at the counter of the aging brick sheriff's office, pen poised lazily over a clipboard. "Adults have a right to walk away if they want to," she said, not unkindly. "Maybe he needed time. Maybe he's up at camp." Reba pressed harder, describing the things that didn't add up. Clarence's unfinished truck repairs, the half-full carton of cigarettes he would never leave behind, the wallet still sitting by the bedside. Deputy Welk's smile faltered. She filled out the paperwork. A bulletin was sent out. A bolo. Be on the lookout. Went up for the beat-up F-150, blue, with missing tailgate and a bumper sticker that read, "If it ain't broke, you're not trying." The official search began with measured steps. 2 deputies canvassed the county's sparse dirt roads and hunting paths. Flyers went up on bulletin boards at gas stations, churches, and diners. A grainy photo of Clarence staring out, eyes squinting against the sun. Volunteers from town organized informal search parties, combing through the skeletal woods with flashlights and thermal drones borrowed from a neighboring district. Still, there was no sign of Clarence. No discarded thermos. No rifle casing. No torn flannel snagged on a branch. Nothing. The tension in Susquehanna County grew dense and sour. People stopped in the middle of grocery store aisles to whisper theories. Had Clarence wandered off and met with an accident? Had he finally broken under the weight of years spent scraping by? Or, the question they didn't want to say too loudly, had someone made him disappear? For Reba, the not knowing was a wound that refused to close. She found herself waking in the night, certain she had heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the creak of the screen door. She would lie in the dark, straining against silence so thick it felt alive. Wayne Keller took to sitting on her porch after sunset, nursing beers and telling stories about their wilder days, as if keeping Clarence's memory alive could somehow tether him back to the world. Reba barely spoke during these vigils, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, watching the tree line, half expecting a figure to emerge, dusty and smiling sheepishly. The first break, if it could be called that, came on the 7th day. A farmer named Glenn Norris, out checking his property line after a night of heavy rain, stumbled upon a set of deep tire ruts cutting through mud at an abandoned field off Route 39. The tracks looked fresh, leading into a thicket of sumac and brambles. Beyond the thicket, hidden under the tangle of overgrowth, was something metallic glinting dully under the overcast sky. It was Clarence's truck. The discovery sent a jolt through the town. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape, combing through the truck with gloved hands and grim expressions. Inside, they found the thermos, still half full of lukewarm coffee. The driver's seat was pushed far back, farther than Clarence would have needed. The rifle was missing. So was Clarence's heavy canvas hunting jacket, the one he wore religiously when braving the fall chill. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no footprints distinct enough to follow. But wedged between the driver's seat and the center console, almost as if it had fallen during a scuffle, they found something chilling. Clarence's wedding band. It was bent slightly, as if crushed under pressure. Deputies theorized that Clarence might have met someone at the field. For what reason, they couldn't say. And that something had gone terribly wrong. The discovery of the truck only deepened the mystery. It raised questions far darker than simple accident or misadventure. It suggested intent. Clarence Bidd hadn't just wandered off into the woods that morning. He had been taken, or forced to go somewhere he never intended to. The truck's discovery should have provided answers. Instead, it only deepened the hollow pit of questions gnawing through Susquehanna County. Days stretched into a tense, brittle silence, broken only by murmured speculations at the Rusty Nail Tavern or in the pews of St. Elmo's Church. Clarence Bidd was nowhere, and worse, there was a single thread left to pull. Or so everyone thought. It was on the 14th day after Clarence's disappearance that Reba found the letter. She almost missed it. The morning had started like every other since Clarence vanished. Mechanical movements stitched together by grief. Reba shuffled to the front porch to fetch the mail, a ritual she no longer performed with hope, only habit. Bills. Catalogs. A pizza coupon addressed to a resident. She was halfway back to the kitchen when she noticed it. A small, nondescript envelope, nearly lost between the folds of a glossy supermarket flyer. There was no return address. No stamp. Just her name, Reba Bidd, handwritten in shaky block letters across the front. Her heart stuttered against her ribs. Inside, folded with almost surgical precision, was a single sheet of lined paper. The words, scrawled in the same jagged hand, sent an icy current down her spine. He's alive. For now. Keep quiet. That was it. No signature. No instructions. No ransom demand. The page trembled between her fingers as she read it again, then again. Was it a cruel prank? Some twisted joke played by one of the town's darker minds? Or was it real? Was Clarence truly still out there, clinging to life somewhere beyond the reach of the flashing lights and search dogs? Reba's first instinct was to call the sheriff's office, to turn the letter over and let them sort out what it meant. But then she remembered the last part. Keep quiet. A threat barely veiled. And so, against every screaming nerve in her body, Reba kept the letter to herself. The weight of the secret grew unbearable almost immediately. Everywhere she went, the letter burned in her mind. At the grocery store, she flinched when a cart bumped her ankle. At church, she sat stiff-backed in the pew, barely hearing the hymns. At home, she tucked the letter inside an old cookbook on the top kitchen shelf, as if bearing could also bury the fear that gnawed through her nights. 3 days later, the second letter arrived. This time, the envelope was wedged between the slats of her mailbox, almost hidden from view. She spotted it only because the afternoon sun caught the edge of white against the shadows. The message was longer now, more deliberate. Meet where the water breaks the rocks. Sunset. Come alone. Tell no one, if you want him back. The location was unmistakable. The spillway down by Cinder's Gorge, a place where the river's current slammed against jagged boulders, hurling up foam and mist in the dying light. The handwriting was the same. The urgency more palpable. Reba pressed the paper against her chest, feeling her heartbeat hammer against it. This was real. Clarence was alive, or someone desperately wanted her to believe he was. Either way, there was no choice. She had to go. At sunset, the gorge became something out of an old fever dream. The sky was smeared with blood-red streaks, the river's roar filling the hollow spaces between the trees. Reba parked her aging sedan at the edge of the woods and picked her way down the overgrown trail, her palms slick with sweat despite the cool air. Every snap of a twig sent adrenaline surging through her veins. Shadows twisted at the edges of her vision. Near the base of the gorge, where the land dropped steeply to the water's edge, Reba stopped. She waited. Minutes bled together. The last of the sun dipped behind the ridge, and the world slipped into an eerie twilight. Then movement. A figure emerged from the tree lean, cloaked in darkness. Tall, wearing a heavy jacket, and a cap pulled low over their face. Reba's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out Clarence's name, but instinct pinned her voice down. She stood frozen, every muscle taut, as the figure approached, not directly, but sideways cautious, as if afraid of being seen. At a distance of 20 yards, The figure dropped something into the dirt. Then, without a word, they turned and melted back into the trees. For a heartbeat, Reba remained rooted, listening to the empty woods. Only when she was certain she was alone again did she move forward. What she found wasn't Clarence. Not even a clue to where he might be. It was a battered Polaroid photograph, damp from the river's mist. In it, Clarence sat slumped against a rough concrete wall. His face was bruised, blood crusted at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, half-lidded, dazed but unmistakably alive, stared hollowly past the camera. A heavy chain looped from his ankle to a rusted pipe bolted into the floor behind him. There was a time-stamp scrawled at the bottom corner of the Polaroid. October 27th, 7:12 p.m. Just yesterday. Tears blurred Reba's vision as she clutched the photograph to her chest. Clarence was alive. He was suffering. And whoever was behind this was not finished. The first letter had been a warning. The second, a test. Now, Reba understood. She was being drawn into a game. One she didn't know the rules to, one with stakes higher than anything she had ever faced. And she was already losing. The photograph had shattered whatever thin illusion of normalcy remained in Reba's life after turning it over to the sheriff's office. Despite the ominous warning of keep quiet, she found herself swept into a maelstrom of interviews, search parties, and whispered interrogations. Clarence's face, battered and hollow, became a permanent fixture on the town's bulletin boards, the grocery store window, even the side of Deputy Holcomb's patrol car. But as the weeks bled into months, the fervor cooled. Leads dried up. The strange figure who had delivered the Polaroid vanished, as if swallowed by the trees. No ransom calls came. No new letters. Nothing. The case unofficially withered into a cold file, thick yellowed, crammed with dead ends and false hopes. Life in Susquehanna County pressed forward, but for Reba, time calcified into something brittle and sharp. The first of the quiet years began in a bleak, early winter. The river froze in thick plates of ice along the banks, and in the mornings, mist would rise and hover like wraiths over fields. Reba withdrew from the community that had once been her entire world. She stopped attending Sunday service. Her spot at the diner, booth 3 by the window, remained empty for so long that new patrons eventually took it without hesitation. She remained in the house Clarence had built with his own hands, refusing every offer to move closer to her sister in Charleston. The empty room spoke in creaks and groans, voices only Reba could hear in the sleepless hours after midnight. Each day she maintained the rituals. Mowing the lawn Clarence once kept pristine, fixing the leaky faucet he never had time for, folding his favorite flannel shirts neatly back into the dresser drawers even as dust layered them. It was as if preserving the past could somehow anchor him to the present, could somehow, impossibly, bring him home. But deep down, Reba began to feel it slipping. The sharp memory of his laugh, the precise shade of blue in his eyes under a summer sun. Those details dulled at the edges, and that slow erosion terrified her more than the thought of his death. Meanwhile, the town itself shifted in subtle, insidious ways. New families moved into the abandoned houses at the edges of town. Faces at the market were younger, hungrier, unfamiliar. The old-timers who remembered Clarence Bidd, who whispered their suspicions behind purse lips, started to die off or drift away to cities where the past didn't loom as heavy. Sheriff Duval, one so determined to crack the case, took early retirement and moved 2 counties over. His replacement, Sheriff Wiley, treated Clarence's file with polite disinterest, stacking it neatly between unsolved burglaries and petty thefts. To most of Susquehanna, Clarence Bidd became a ghost story, a tragic tale to tell after one too many whiskeys at the Rusty Nail. A cautionary myth about trusting strangers or wandering too far from home after dark. Only Reba kept vigil. Every October, the anniversary of Clarence's disappearance, she left a small candle burning on the front porch, its tiny flame flickering bravely against the autumn winds. Some years, it guttered out within hours. Some years, it burned through the night. She never missed a year. Yet even within the suffocating silence of the quiet years, faint ripples disturbed the surface. Small things. A muddy boot print on her porch one spring morning. Too large to be hers. Too fresh to dismiss. A crumpled cigarette, but with an unfamiliar brand left smoldering on the edge of her property. One Halloween, a plastic jack-o'-lantern was smashed against her front door. The inside filled not with candy, but a tangle of rusted chains. Each time, Reba reported these incidents to the sheriff's office. Each time, they chalked it up to teenagers, trespassers, her own growing paranoia. But Reba knew better. Someone was watching. Someone hadn't forgotten. The strangest event occurred exactly 5 years after Clarence's disappearance. On an otherwise unremarkable evening in late October, Reba returned from the market to find her kitchen window slightly ajar. Inside, everything appeared untouched, except for one chilling detail. Sitting neatly on the kitchen table was Clarence's old leather wallet, the same one he had carried everywhere, worn, scuffed, the corner frayed where he used to thumb it absently while waiting in line. Reba's hand shook as she flipped it open. Inside were familiar contents. His driver's license, a faded photograph of the two of them at the county fair, $3 in worn bills. But it was a small scrap of paper tucked behind the license that made her knees buckle. 3 words, written in that same jagged, blocky hand. Still not over. No fingerprints were lifted from the wallet. No signs of forced entry were found. Sheriff Wiley advised her to maybe take a vacation and try not to dwell. But Reba knew what the town refused to acknowledge. Clarence's story wasn't finished. Somewhere out there, the truth still lived. Festering, patient, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And Reba, bound by loyalty, grief, and a growing fury, vowed silently to be ready when it did. As the years slipped by, the town of Susquehanna began to accept the tragic fact that Clarence Bidd was gone. For Reba, it was still a haunting specter that loomed over her every waking moment. But to the rest of the world, Clarence's disappearance had become just another cold case, the kind of story that fades into the archives of forgotten mysteries. However, for someone like Lisa Bidd, the younger sister who had moved away to Charleston years ago, the passage of time only fueled the need for answers. Lisa had never been one to quietly accept the world's injustices. She had spent her life fighting, whether it was for her dreams of becoming a lawyer, her passion for civil rights, or her love for her family. So when she received a phone call from Reba in the fall of 2006, just days before the 5-year anniversary of Clarence's disappearance, something inside her stirred. Reba's voice had been worn, strained. "Lisa, I can't do this alone anymore. I need your help. I think someone is still out there, someone who knows what happened to him." At the time, Lisa was entrenched in the demands of her fast-paced legal career, living a life that was far removed from the dusty roads and quiet, claustrophobic corners of Susquehanna. But she had always carried her brother's absence with her like a weight on her chest, a jagged edge in the back of her mind. The world had moved on, but she never had. Not really. "Give me 2 days," Lisa had said, before hanging up the phone. It was a promise she couldn't afford to break. Lisa arrived in Susquehanna on a cold, overcast Thursday morning, her sleek black car gliding down the winding dirt roads that led into the heart of the town. The house on Maple Street where she and Clarence had grown up looked exactly the same as when she had left, almost too still in the early light of dawn, as though frozen in time. Reba stood on the porch waiting for her, her expression unreadable. She was thinner, paler than Lisa remembered, but the sharpness in her eyes had not dulled. "Thanks for coming," Reba murmured, her voice quiet but laden with years of sorrow. "I never should have left," Lisa replied, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "Not for so long. I'm sorry." Reba gave a slight nod, and the 2 women walked inside the house, the door creaking softly as it opened. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old wood and dust, a scent that would forever be attached to memories of their family. The once vibrant home had grown hollow over the years, its walls bare of any pictures that once filled the space with warmth. The two women sat in the living room, the silence between them thick, until Lisa finally broke it. "I've been looking through the old case files," Lisa said, pulling a manila folder from her leather bag and placing it on the coffee table between them. "There are things in here, things I don't understand." Before we proceed, kindly hit the subscribe button for more real crime videos like this. Reba watched her eyes wide with barely concealed hope. Lisa opened the folder, pulling out several pages of documents. She flipped through them carefully, her fingers brushing over the evidence as though it could lead her to the answers. "This report," she continued, reading aloud from a police statement, "mentions a car found by the river. They searched it for fingerprints, right? Well, they found something odd, something that was never mentioned in the final report." "What was it?" Reba's voice was strained, but there was a glimmer of something, maybe anticipation, maybe fear, behind her words. Lisa hesitated before speaking, the weight of the discovery sitting heavy on her tongue. There were traces of blood in the trunk. Not a lot, but enough to raise suspicion. The strange thing is, there was no sign of a struggle at the scene. No obvious cause of injury. No missing person report ever listed a potential for bloodshed. She paused, her gaze piercing. What if Clarence wasn't just taken? What if he fought back? Reba stiffened, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in on her. The idea that Clarence might have been involved in a violent struggle, that he might have tried to escape, it was almost too much to comprehend. "I've been thinking the same thing," Reba said finally, her voice small but resolute. "There's something more to this. Someone has to know." Lisa nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. "Then we'll find out. We're not leaving this town until we do." For the next several weeks, Lisa and Reba scoured through old records, talked to former neighbors, and even confronted people who had long since buried their memories of Clarence's disappearance. It was exhausting work, fraught with frustration, but Lisa's relentless nature never wavered. She knew that the truth was out there, hidden somewhere in the dust of the past, and she was determined to uncover it. But as they dug deeper, they began to notice something that unsettled them. The more questions they asked, the more people seemed to avoid them. It was as if the town had decided it was better to leave the past alone, to let Clarence's disappearance remain an unsolved mystery. Every door they knocked on closed quietly. Every lead they followed petered out. Yet, despite the growing sense of being watched, of being subtly threatened, Lisa refused to stop. She felt the pull of duty to Clarence, to her family, and to the justice that had eluded them for so long. One evening, as the two women sat in the living room poring over the case files, Lisa received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was gruff, its tone low and urgent. "Lisa Bidd," the man asked. "Yes, who is this?" Lisa replied, her pulse quickening. "I've got information. You want to know what happened to your brother? Meet me at the old mill by the river. Midnight. Come alone." The line went dead before she could respond. Lisa stared at the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Who was it?" Reba asked from the doorway, her brow furrowing. Lisa's expression hardened, a sense of purpose settling in her chest. Someone who knows more than they should. Without another word, she stood and headed for the door. It was time to find out who had been watching them and what they knew. The years after Lisa's encounter at the old mill blurred into a haze of unanswered questions and silent frustrations. Despite that night's chilling meeting and the cryptic information shared there, no concrete leads emerged. Hopes rose and fell like the seasons in Suswana, and by the spring of 2020, even Lisa had grown weary. The world had changed, bustling with pandemics and unrest. But Clarence Bidd's name remained carved into the neglected corner of missing persons files, gathering dust. And yet, fate, as it often does, refused to let the truth stay buried. On a humid June evening in 2020, Officer Miguel Thornton of the Suswana County Sheriff's Department was running routine traffic patrol on a stretch of back road that curled just outside town limits. A two-lane highway surrounded by endless fields of dry, brittle grass. It was supposed to be an uneventful shift. The kind of quiet night Thornton, a young recruit barely 2 years on the job, had grown used to. At 9:43 p.m., a battered blue Ford Taurus sped past his cruiser, doing 15 over the limit, its muffler rattling violently against the cracked asphalt. Thornton clicked on his lights, pulled onto the road, and gave brief chase. The car pulled over almost immediately, its turn signal flashing a nervous, mechanical blink in the darkness. Thornton approached carefully, his flashlight slicing through the night. As he neared the driver's side window, he caught the faint smell of sweat and something sharper, something almost metallic, carried on the breeze. The driver was a wiry man in his mid-40s, unshaven, twitchy. He offered up a cracked smile, but his hands trembled slightly as he handed over his license and registration. "Evening, officer," the man mumbled, voice thick. "Evening," Thornton replied coolly, studying him. "You know why I pulled you over?" The man nodded quickly, too quickly, like someone trying to end a conversation before it even began. "Speeding," he muttered. Thornton nodded and took the documents back to his cruiser to run them through the system. That's when something strange happened. The name on the license, Gary Latimer, triggered a flag alert, a request for notification placed by the state's Missing Persons Division. Thornton frowned. It was unusual for an ordinary speeding ticket to be connected to something so serious. He read the alert carefully. Gary Latimer was an alias connected to a cold case, a suspect of interest tied indirectly to multiple unresolved disappearances, one of which included a 2001 case. Clarence Bidd. Thornton's heart thudded against his ribcage. He returned to the Taurus, his hand instinctively hovering closer to the grip of his weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Gary Latimer hesitated, just a beat too long, before unbuckling and complying. His body language screamed tension. Every muscle seemed ready to bolt. Thornton didn't hesitate. He placed him in handcuffs under suspicion of providing false identification, a small technicality, to keep him detained long enough for backup to arrive. While Thornton waited, he decided to search the car, and it was there in the cluttered, grimy back seat that he found it, an old, cracked photo album. Inside, tucked among yellowed Polaroids and curling photographs, was a picture that stole the breath from Thornton's lungs. A photo of Clarence Bidd. Clarence standing outside what looked like a small, run-down cabin in the woods, a hand resting warily on the doorframe. He looked older than the last known photos, his hair longer, a beard scruffy on his face. But it was him, without question. The album held more. Candid photos, notes scribbled in shaking hand, receipts from gas stations miles away. Thornton realized with a dawning horror that whoever Gary Latimer truly was, he had been keeping tabs on Clarence for years. By the time backup arrived, the situation had escalated. Latimer, cornered and desperate, had begun babbling incoherently, swinging between furious denial and terrified confession. His words tumbled out in a chaotic flood. "I didn't kill him. I didn't kill nobody. I just kept him safe. They made me watch him." Thornton's stomach twisted at the words. Who was they? Gary Latimer was taken into custody without further resistance, but the questions he raised unraveled into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Lisa Bidd was contacted within 24 hours. When she picked up the call from the Susquehanna Sheriff's Department, she was standing in her kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee, never imagining that a simple ring of the phone would fracture her world apart once again. The voice on the other end was brisk but careful. "Miss Bidd, this is Detective Roland Miles. I believe we've had a breakthrough in your brother's case." Lisa nearly dropped the mug in her hand, her fingers trembling so hard she had to set it down on the counter. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "What kind of breakthrough?" she whispered. Miles hesitated, as if weighing the enormity of the news. "A man was arrested last night. He had evidence, photographs, documents, And based on what we found so far, there's strong reason to believe Clarence Bidd may have survived long past his disappearance date. Lisa leaned heavily against the counter, the room spinning slightly. For 19 years, she had lived with the image of her brother lost to the earth, buried or forgotten. Now a new, terrible possibility emerged. He hadn't vanished. He had been alive, somewhere, suffering. The thought struck her like a physical blow. The next morning, Lisa sat in the sheriff's department, hands clenched tightly around a styrofoam cup of coffee gone cold. Across from her sat Detective Miles, a thick folder in his hands, its contents thick enough to sink a heart. We believe Clarence may have been held captive by a small, isolated group operating just outside county lines, he said, carefully flipping through the photos. We're still working out the details. Gary Latimer wasn't acting alone. Lisa leaned forward, the world narrowing down to just her, the detective, and the awful, inevitable truth that had begun to unfold. There's something else, Miles added, sliding a final photograph across the table. Lisa stared down at it. It was another picture of Clarence, this time older, thinner, more broken. But what shattered her completely wasn't just the sight of her brother. It was the date stamped at the bottom corner of the photo. December 2019. Less than a year ago, Clarence Bidd had been alive. Recently, the discovery of Clarence Bidd's recent photograph sent shockwaves through the investigation team. But it was only the beginning. With Gary Latimer in custody, the next logical step was to dissect every piece of physical evidence he had hoarded over the years. What lay buried inside his chaotic life might finally explain what happened to Clarence, and who else had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The forensic team, led by veteran analyst Dr. Andrea Hollis, descended upon the evidence like surgeons preparing for a delicate, life-saving operation. Every scrap of paper, every faded receipt, every photograph was cataloged with meticulous precision. They set up a temporary command post inside an unused wing of the sheriff's department, knowing that if anything slipped through their fingers, the truth might be lost forever. It wasn't long before they found it, a key piece of evidence that had, until now, hidden in plain sight. Inside the lining of the old, battered photo album was a folded, sweat-stained map. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a child's scrawl. Lines, crosses, indecipherable notations. But under ultraviolet light, hidden ink bloomed across the surface, revealing detailed coordinates and coded references to structures tucked deep within Sassuana's overgrown outskirts. One name stood out, repeated 3 times, like a desperate mantra. Compound 7. Detective Roland Miles leaned over the table, his jaw tightening as he took in the evidence. Compound 7. It sounded militaristic, organized, not the work of a lone drifter like Latimer. This hinted at something bigger, more coordinated, perhaps even a network built to operate just beyond the fringes of everyday society. Dr. Hollis wasn't finished. Next, she turned her attention to the photos themselves. Using digital enhancement tools, she cleaned up the grainy images. In the background of one picture, a shot of Clarence standing against a chain-link fence, his eyes hollow, his body shockingly gaunt. There was a detail no one had noticed before, a patch sewn onto the jacket Clarence wore. Hollis zoomed in, her screen flickering slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. The patch depicted an abstract symbol, a circle, broken into 4 uneven quadrants, with a dagger running vertically through its center. Beside the symbol were 3 block letters, faded but legible. CUR. No one in the room recognized it immediately, but the realization that Clarence had been branded, literally marked by whatever organization had held him, sent a palpable ripple of tension through the room. The case was no longer about a single missing person. It was about dismantling a system. Meanwhile, another forensic breakthrough came from an unexpected corner. Gary Latimer's old cell phone, a battered Nokia relic that had somehow survived years of abandonment. Technician Laura Kiefer painstakingly extracted its battered SIM card and managed to retrieve fragments of text messages. Nearly all deleted, but a handful remained buried deep in the system's memory. One message, Sent just weeks before Latimer's arrest, read, "Extraction delayed. Keep the package secure. C7 compromised." The language was clinical, terrifying in its coldness. Package. They had reduced Clarence to a commodity, a liability to be moved, hidden, or eliminated when convenient. Detective Miles scribbled down the notes furiously. Each new discovery unraveling the threads of what he now saw was a far more sinister tapestry than he dared imagine. But the real bombshell dropped late that evening. At precisely 11:47 p.m., forensic technician Kiefer entered the temporary war room with a grim expression carved into her face. In her hand was a manila envelope containing the results of fingerprint analysis run on the recovered photographs, map, and Latimer's possessions. They had found multiple unidentified fingerprints, an expected outcome given the nature of the evidence. But one set in particular matched someone no one could have anticipated. Sheriff Daniel Kincaid, the elected sheriff of Susquehanna County, Thornton and Miles's own boss. For a heartbeat, the room stood frozen in a heavy, stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted in low, urgent murmurs. How deep did the corruption go? Had Kincaid known about Clarence's captivity all along? Had he facilitated it, covered it up, perhaps even profited from it? Miles clenched his fists at his sides, battling 1,000 swirling emotions. Betrayal, fury, disgust, fear. He understood immediately. If Kincaid was involved, then everyone in this investigation was in danger. The only thing more dangerous than chasing the truth was finding it. By dawn, the team realized they had a narrow window. If they didn't move fast, before Kincaid caught wind of their discoveries, Clarence's slim chance at rescue might vanish once again, this time permanently. Lisa Bidd sat quietly in the corner of the room, the file of forensic results left forgotten in her lap. She stared at the blurry, enhanced photo of her brother, her knuckles white around the edges of the paper. She had waited 19 years. She wasn't about to let them steal him from her again. Not now. The courtroom felt heavier than stone, thick with combined weight of nearly 2 decades of betrayal, lies, and hope flickering on its last breath. The trial of Sheriff Daniel Kincaid and Gary Latimer wasn't just a procedural event. It was a reckoning, a desperate fight for a town soul and for Clarence Bidd's stolen years. From the moment the double doors creaked open and the first rows filled with tight-faced townspeople, the atmosphere inside the Susquehanna County Courthouse was electric with restrained rage and fragile expectation. Lisa Bidd sat near the front, flanked by federal marshals and agents who now led the case. She gripped a small gold locket around her neck, a keepsake of Clarence's childhood. So tightly it left faint, angry marks across her fingers. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Mia Calderon, opened with a chilling portrait. A boy forgotten, sold out by those sworn to protect him. Calderon's voice never rose above a measured tone, but her words cut sharper than any blade, detailing how Kincaid orchestrated the cover-up and how Latimer served as the keeper of stolen lives. Projected onto a massive screen was the image that had haunted the investigation team. Clarence's photo, the symbol on his jacket unmistakable. Jurors flinched. Reporters scribbled feverishly. Calderon did not spare them from a horror. She laid out the web of deceit. Secret bank transfers tied to shell companies, suspicious land purchases masking illegal compounds, intercepted encrypted communications mentioning package C7. Every piece of evidence, from the map found in Latimer's photo album to the fingerprints lifted from key documents, stacked higher and heavier than anyone in the courtroom could have prepared for. And yet, the defense mounted a furious counterattack. Kincaid's high-powered attorneys painted him as a scapegoat, an aging lawman tangled in the manipulations of a rogue underling. They hinted that evidence might have been misinterpreted or even planted in a rush to solve a cold case that had festered too long in public memory. They leaned heavily on his decades of decorated service, filling the air with nostalgic tales of valor and sacrifice. For a while, it worked. You could feel the jury wrestle with it. The seductive comfort of believing a respected figure couldn't possibly have engineered something so monstrous. A part of the town itself resisted facing its own corruption, as though acknowledgement would shatter what little remained of their pride. But then Clarence himself took the stand. The courtroom hushed to a breathless silence when he stepped forward. A thin figure, stooped slightly, bearing the invisible scars of confinement. His voice was soft but steady, recounting days spent locked away, indoctrinated, conditioned into silence under threats so vivid they still haunted his dreams. He spoke of the men who visited the compound wearing uniforms not unlike Kincaid's deputies, of whisper exchanges he overheard about keeping the sheriff happy, about supplies delivered in county vehicles under the cover of darkness. When Clarence finished, the silence that followed was not just a lack of noise. It was a living thing, filling every corner of the room with its crushing presence. Defense attorneys tried to rattle him during cross-examination, insinuating false memories, coached testimony. But Clarence's authenticity, his raw, unvarnished pain, was something no jury could unsee. Every word from his mouth landed like a hammer on the defense's crumbling narrative. Days blurred into nights as witness after witness fortified the prosecution's fortress of evidence. Forensic experts, financial analysts, digital recovery specialists, each adding more damning weight to the towering case against Kincaid and Latimer. Still, the defense played every card they could, stoking technicalities, exploiting moments of doubt. The final days of the trial felt like walking a tightrope over an endless chasm, every minute carrying the unbearable possibility of collapse. On the 17th day, the jury was sent into deliberation. Those hours, each one grinding slower than the last, tested the endurance of everyone waiting. Lisa sat unmoving, her hands folded, her eyes glazed yet sharp with something unbreakable. Clarence, by her side, remained eerily calm, as though the worst had already been endured, and everything now was mere formality. When the bailiff finally re-entered the courtroom holding the verdict slip, time itself seemed to shudder and pause. The foreperson stood, voice trembling slightly, and delivered the words. "We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Kincaid guilty on all counts. We, the jury, find the defendant Gary Latimer guilty on all counts." A single choked sob broke free somewhere behind Lisa, a note of both mourning and triumph. Around the room, people wept, some openly, others with silent streams of tears carving down stony faces. Judge Evelyn Hartwell, a woman with a reputation for measured mercy, showed no hesitation. Her sentencing, scheduled for a later date, was expected to be severe. Life terms were already whispered across the buzzing courtroom floor. But as the gavel came down with a sharp, resonant crack, it wasn't just two men who were judged. It was an entire broken system. It was a beginning of reckoning. For Suswana, for Clarence, for every life trampled under the weight of corruption and forgotten promises. When the dust of the trial finally settled, Suswana was not the same town that it had been the day Clarence Bidd disappeared. The courthouse steps, once a place of solemn civic pride, had become a gathering spot for uneasy stares and whispered apologies. Reporters packed up their cameras and microphones, their presence leaving behind a rawness, as if the town had been stripped bare and left to shiver in its shame. Clarence Bidd emerged into the cool, gray light of early winter, flanked by Lisa and a handful of trusted federal agents. There was no parade, no brass band welcoming him back. Only the uncertain murmurs of community struggling to reconcile what had been hidden in their midst for nearly 2 decades. The first few weeks were a blur for Clarence. Interviews, therapy sessions, endless meetings with legal teams about possible civil suits. He moved through it all like a man walking underwater, aware of the world around him but somehow separate from it, each moment both overwhelming and numbingly hollow. Lisa stayed close, fiercely protective. She had fought so long and so hard that now, in victory, she seemed unsure what to do with her hands, her voice, her life. At night, Clarence sometimes sat in the small guest house Lisa had prepared for him, staring out at the dense trees behind her home, the same kind that had bordered the compound where he'd been imprisoned. Sometimes he'd hear the rustle of a branch or the lonely hoot of an owl, and his muscles would tighten instinctively, bracing for threats that were no longer there. The scars were invisible but permanent. The town tried, in small ways, to make amends. The mayor issued a public apology, vowing reforms. Memorial services were held for other victims whose fates were suspected but never fully confirmed. There was talk of renaming the town library after Clarence, though he privately doubted he would ever walk through its doors. More profoundly, Suswana struggled with his collective guilt. Conversations that had long been avoided now surfaced, about systemic corruption, about blind trust in authority, about the unspoken rules that had allowed monsters like Kincaid to thrive under the guise of good man. For Lisa, the end of the trial didn't mean the end of her mission. She began pushing for new legislation, reaching out to victims' rights groups, appearing at conferences and town halls. Clarence's story, she realized, was bigger than just one brother's tragedy. It was a warning, a call to vigilance for communities everywhere. Meanwhile, Clarence worked quietly with trauma counselors and reintegration specialists. The simple things, ordering at a restaurant, using a smartphone, making small talk, felt alien and monumental all at once. There were days he thought about retreating into solitude, disappearing again, but this time by choice. And yet, there were also small victories. One afternoon, months after the verdict, Lisa found Clarence sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up and smiled, not the hollow reflex of a survivor, but something real, something alive. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was there. Life, fragile and stubborn, was finding its way back. As spring approached, Clarence started volunteering with a local youth group, quietly mentoring kids who had seen too much too young. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a seed planted, one that might, one day, grow into something stronger than the pain that had almost destroyed him. The past would never be erased. Some ghost would linger in the edges of Clarence's vision for the rest of his days. But the future, uncertain, messy, daunting, was his again to claim. And as the sun dipped below the scarred but healing town of Suswana, Clarence Bidd, once forgotten, now stood as a testament not to what had been stolen, but to what could never truly be taken. The screen fades slowly to a montage of Clarence standing under the wide, open sky, the sharp blues and golds of early summer washing over the town of Suswana, a town bruised but not broken. Narration weaves in steady and intimate, guiding the viewer into a final reflection. Clarence Bidd's story is not just about survival. It's about the unbearable cost of silence, the quiet destruction wrought by indifference, and a relentless, stubborn light of human resilience. As Clarence helps a young boy lift a kite into the air, a boy who once sat silent and frightened in court, the scene shifts. Images flash of Lisa Bidd speaking passionately at a victims' advocacy summit, the fire in her eyes undimmed by the years of heartbreak. Another clip shows a weathered plaque being mounted in the town square, in honor of those who were lost and those who fought to bring them home. The camera lingers for a moment on Clarence's face. Older now, worn by time, but alive with a depth of presence that can only be forged through unimaginable endurance. His smile is quiet, hard-won, the corners of his mouth pulling upward not in triumph, but in defiant gratitude. It took years for the truth to come to light. Years for one voice, Lisa's voice, to pierce through layers of denial and fear. Clarence's story is a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, so long as we refuse to look away. The narration softens, a quiet urgency threading through the words. Somewhere right now, there are still people waiting to be found, families waiting for answers, communities struggling to heal wounds they barely acknowledge. The fight is not over. We must be vigilant. We must listen to the whispers others would rather ignore. We must believe those who cry out in the wilderness. Then a direct call to action, woven naturally into the emotional tapestry. Support local and national organizations fighting for missing persons and victims of abuse. Educate yourself. Volunteer. Speak up when others stay silent. Because one voice, your voice, can be the difference between another forgotten soul and a story of survival. As these words resonate, the final montage slows. Clarence and Lisa sit side by side on the porch as twilight descends, an unspoken bond shimmering between them. The world beyond their doorstep remains flawed, wounded, but together they are proof that healing is possible. The screen fades to black, and a simple phrase appears in white letters. Never forget, never stop fighting, never lose hope. Soft, aching piano music carries the viewer into the credits, the weight of Clarence's journey pressing gently, insistently, into their hearts, an imprint that won't easily fade. Do you believe justice was fully served without Clarence's body being found? Tell us below. Comment your thoughts. Always like and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories where the truth is stranger than fiction.